Every war begins with confidence. Almost every defeat begins the same way. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte ruled Europe. No general in modern history had ever achieved what he had. Austria defeated. Prussia crushed. Europe reorganized under French power. Armies feared him. Kings negotiated with him. Entire nations collapsed after a single campaign. For nearly a decade, Napoleon had rewritten the rules of war. Speed, concentration of force, decisive, battle. His enemies prepared slowly. Napoleon moved faster. And every time Europe united against him, Europe lost. By the summer of 1812, Napoleon commanded the largest army ever assembled on the continent, over 600,000 soldiers from across Europe. French veterans, Polish cavalry, German divisions, Italian troops. It was not just an army. It was an empire on the move. The objective seemed simple: force Russia into submission and end resistance to French dominance. Napoleon believed one decisive campaign would finish the war. He had done it before. But Russia was not Austria. Russia was not Prussia. Russia was distance. Russia was time. Russia was space itself. And Napoleon was about to fight an enemy that refused to play by his rules. Instead of defending cities, the Russians retreated. Instead of protecting territory, they destroyed it. Villages burned, supplies vanished, roads emptied. With every victory, Napoleon moved deeper into a country that seemed to dissolve before him. The Grand Army advanced without realizing one terrifying truth. The deeper they marched into Russia, the further they marched away from survival. Napoleon expected a battle. Russia offered something far more dangerous: a war without an ending. And for the first time in his career, speed would become his greatest enemy. Napoleon crossed into Russia expecting victory within weeks. Everything about his past campaigns supported that belief. Enemy armies usually defended their capitals. They fought decisive battles. They surrendered after defeat. But the Russian army did something completely unexpected. It retreated. Again and again, French forces advanced, and again the enemy disappeared. Cities were abandoned before battle. Fields were burned. Food supplies vanished. Napoleon kept winning territory, but gaining nothing of value. Each march forward stretched his supply lines further across hostile land. Thousands of wagons struggled along primitive roads. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Soldiers began living off land that no longer existed. This was not a retreat born from weakness. It was strategy. Russian commanders understood something Napoleon did not. Russia did not need to defeat Napoleon's army. It only needed to survive it. Every kilometer east weakened the invaders. Every day increased hunger. Every delay favored Russia. The Grande Armée continued forward, convinced that one final battle would end the campaign. Napoleon believed Moscow would force peace. He believed Russia would eventually obey the logic of European warfare. But Russia was fighting a different kind of war. A war of patience. A war of exhaustion. A war where victory meant simply refusing to lose. By the time Napoleon realized what was happening, his army had already crossed the point of no return. The trap had closed not with a battle, but with distance, fire, and time. And ahead waited Moscow. By September 1812, Napoleon finally achieved what he had pursued for months. Moscow stood before him. After the brutal Battle of Borodino, the Russian army withdrew once more, leaving the ancient capital exposed. For Napoleon, this moment confirmed everything he believed about war. He had reached the enemy's heart. Surely, peace would follow. On September 14, the Grande Armée entered Moscow. But something was wrong. The city was silent. No delegation arrived. No surrender was offered. No negotiations began. Moscow was empty. Most civilians had fled. Government officials were gone. Supplies had disappeared. Instead of victory celebrations, French soldiers found abandoned streets and deserted homes. Then the fires began. Flames spread across the city, night after night. Warehouses burned. Food reserves vanished. Entire districts collapsed into smoke and ash. Napoleon had captured Moscow, but Moscow refused to be captured. The emperor waited for Tsar Alexander to ask for peace. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing happened. Every hour inside Moscow weakened the French army. Discipline declined. Horses died. Winter approached. Napoleon faced an impossible decision: remain in a destroyed city without supplies, or retreat across the same devastated land he had crossed before. For the first time in his career, Napoleon had won the battlefield, yet lost the strategic reality. The victory he needed had never existed. Moscow was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of disaster. And soon, the greatest army in Europe would begin a retreat that history would remember as one of the worst catastrophes ever suffered by a military force. In October 1812, Napoleon made the decision he had tried to avoid. He ordered the retreat. The army that had entered Russia as the greatest force Europe had ever seen now turned west, hoping simply to survive. Winter arrived early. Temperatures dropped below freezing. Snow covered the roads. Supply wagons broke apart in ice and mud. The retreat quickly became chaos. Soldiers lacked winter clothing. Many had already exhausted their food supplies inside Moscow. Horses collapsed by the thousands, leaving artillery and wagons abandoned along the road. Without horses, the army lost mobility. Without mobility, it lost protection. Russian forces followed relentlessly. They avoided large battles, striking instead at isolated units, supply columns, and stragglers. Cossack cavalry appeared suddenly, attacking and disappearing into the snow. Hunger spread faster than the cold. Men searched frozen fields for food. Discipline collapsed. Units dissolved into desperate groups, struggling to reach safety. The same distance that had protected Russia now destroyed Napoleon's army. Every kilometer west cost thousands of lives. Frostbite crippled soldiers overnight. Weapons froze. Exhausted men lay down in the snow and never rose again. The Grande Armée was no longer an army. It was a column of survivors. By the time Napoleon's forces reached the Berezina River, catastrophe was unavoidable. Bridges collapsed under pressure. Soldiers drowned in freezing water, and panic spread through the ranks. What had begun as conquest ended as escape. Out of more than 600,000 soldiers who entered Russia, only a fraction would return. Napoleon had not been defeated in a single battle. He had been defeated by time, distance, climate, and a strategy designed to outlast him. The myth of invincibility died in the Russian winter. When the remnants of Napoleon's army finally crossed back into Europe, the world understood something had changed. The emperor who had dominated the continent for over a decade was no longer invincible. News of the disaster spread rapidly across Europe. Courts that once feared Napoleon now sensed opportunity. Former allies reconsidered their loyalty. Neutral states prepared for war. Napoleon returned to Paris ahead of his army, attempting to maintain the image of control. Outwardly, the empire still existed, but its foundation had been shattered in Russia. The Grande Armée, the instrument that enforced Napoleon's power, was gone. Hundreds of thousands of experienced soldiers had vanished. Veteran officers were dead or captured. Cavalry formations no longer existed. Artillery units lacked horses. Equipment had been abandoned across thousands of kilometers. Napoleon began rebuilding immediately, raising new armies from young recruits and exhausted populations. But armies cannot be replaced overnight. Experience cannot be recreated. Confidence cannot be ordered. Europe recognized the weakness. Prussia revolted. Austria rejoined the coalition. Russia advanced westward, no longer defending its homeland, but carrying the war into Central Europe. For the first time, Napoleon faced enemies who believed victory was possible. The balance of power had shifted permanently. The campaign in Russia did not simply destroy an army. It destroyed fear. And once Europe stopped fearing Napoleon, resistance became inevitable. Within 2 years, the emperor who once ruled nearly all of Europe would be fighting not for dominance, but for survival. The Russian campaign had transformed the hunter into the hunted. Napoleon did not lose in Russia because of winter. That is the myth history remembers. The real defeat began long before the first snow fell. For years, Napoleon had built a system designed for rapid victories. His strategy depended on speed, decisive battles, and short campaigns that forced enemies to surrender before resources ran out. In Western Europe, this system was unstoppable. But Russia changed the rules of war. Instead of defending territory, Russia defended time. Instead of protecting cities, it sacrificed them. Instead of seeking victory, it pursued endurance. Napoleon's greatest strength, offensive momentum, became his greatest weakness. The further he advanced, the weaker he became. Logistics stretched beyond control. Supply lines grew impossible to defend. Every success increased vulnerability. Russia understood a brutal truth. A powerful army far from home eventually defeats itself. By refusing decisive battle, Russian commanders transformed geography into a weapon. Distance replaced fortresses. Climate replaced armies. Time replaced strategy. Napoleon captured Moscow, but failed to achieve the only victory that mattered: political collapse of his enemy. Without that collapse, the campaign had no ending. And wars without endings cannot be won. The Russian campaign revealed a universal law of warfare. Military genius cannot overcome strategic reality. Napoleon remained one of history's greatest commanders. His battlefield brilliance never disappeared. But even genius has limits. In 1812, Napoleon did not simply lose an army. He proved that victory in war belongs not only to those who fight best, but to those who choose battles that can actually be won. History teaches the same lesson again and again. Even the greatest powers fall.